This was the last photo taken of legendary rapper Tupac Shakur just minutes before he was gunned down on Las Vegas Boulevard in 1996. Tupac was hit 4 times and was put on life support at a nearby hospital where he would end up dying a week later. His body was cremated the next day, and members of his rap group Outlaws smoked some of his ashes after mixing them with some kush. Here's a 1907 mugshot of Bertha Baranda after she was convicted of mayhem for slicing off her husband's penis with a straight razor. In 1939, Gone with the Wind actress Hattie McDaniel became the first ever African American to win an Oscar. When she was dying from cancer in 1952, her final wish was to be buried in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in LA. But the request was ultimately denied since the cemetery had a strict all-white policy at the time. George Washington died when his doctors were trying to cure his sore throat. They were using a process called bloodletting, which involved draining a patient's blood until their illness was cured. He lost nearly half his blood before they stopped the treatment, and he died a few hours afterwards. 26-year-old Mark Leeson suffocated in his sleep after shoving 2 tampons up his nose before going to bed. Apparently, he was just trying to find a solution for his snoring problem. It's estimated that throughout the world, about 25 people are killed by champagne corks every year. A British student was once taking an exam and couldn't handle the stress and anxiety anymore. So he put 2 pencils up his nostrils and headbutted the desk, forcing the pencils through his brain. He died instantly, and all the other students got automatic A's. This photo is the definition of fear. A young woman from LA was evading a home intruder by hiding on her roof, where she managed to grab her phone and call 911. She said her greatest fear was that the intruder would try to hide where she was hiding. Luckily, authorities soon had the area surrounded, and the man is now in prison. Here's some disturbing footage of an old lady with a knife approaching the front door of a New Jersey home at 3 a.m. As creepy as the footage may seem, the poor woman is most likely just suffering from dementia. And finally, this is why you should always be aware of your surroundings while scuba diving. This South African salvage diver nearly had his head taken off by a great white, but luckily the shark wasn't hungry at the time. While filming the first Guardians of the Galaxy, Chris Pratt stole his Star-Lord costumes from the set. He did this so that he could wear them to visit sick children in the hospital if the film happened to be a hit. Following the 9/11 attacks, the Maasai tribe from Kenya donated 14 cows to the United States. It was the highest regard of sympathy they could have offered since they view cows as incredibly sacred. A Syrian man with Down syndrome named Jad Issa not only had a child with his wife but also raised him to become a doctor. In the Netherlands, sex is recognized as a right that everyone should enjoy. Citizens with disabilities even receive government money to pay for sexual services up to 12 times per year. The program is called Hookers for the Handicapped. Actor Joaquin Phoenix grew up in a cult called Children of God, which reportedly praised pedophilia. His parents even traveled to Venezuela to recruit followers, but have claimed they were unaware of any child predation. The family changed their last name to Phoenix to symbolize their new life after leaving the cult. Due to the skin's elasticity, it would take 3 full rotations to completely remove the human head. Don't ask how I know that. For the average adult, there are about 10 pounds of organisms living in and on you that are exclusively not you. There was a form of medieval torture where the victim's feet were covered in salt and a goat would start licking them. Known as tickle torture, it would become extremely painful once the skin was worn away by the rough tongue of the goat, creating a wound with salt slowly trickling in. This is the unbelievable anatomy of conjoined twins Brittany and Abby Hensel, who are now 32 years old. Notably, they have 4 lungs but 1 rib cage, 2 hearts, 1 liver, 2 stomachs, 1 set of intestines, 3 kidneys, and 1 pelvis. Modern bulletproof vests were invented in the 1970s by pizza shop owner and former U.S. Marine Richard Davis. He came up with the idea after being wounded when a pizza delivery turned into a shootout. He shot himself in the chest nearly 200 times to test his invention. This is an example of a pillory which was used as a form of capital punishment in 19th century China. The man in the photo can't reach his hands to his face, so he must rely on pedestrians to give him food and water like a dog. The device also made it incredibly hard to sleep comfortably, essentially torturing the prisoner until they died from starvation. If Barbie were a real person, she wouldn't be capable of lifting up her own head and would have to walk on all 4s due to her proportions. She would be severely anorexic and suffer from chronic diarrhea due to only having room for a few inches of intestines and half a liver. At some point during the Middle Ages, it was believed that sperm produced by the left testicle resulted in having a girl. So to ensure having a son, men would sometimes have it removed. Here's a photo of anti-war demonstrators protesting outside the 1968 DNC in Chicago. Shirtless protester Frank Plata was later drafted by the U.S. Army and killed during the Vietnam War. When Japan executes criminals by hanging, 3 different buttons on the wall are pressed by 3 different people at the same time. This is so that none of them know who actually did the killing, since only one button is randomly programmed to open the trap door. Former face of Subway Jared Fogle became famous after attributing his 275-pound weight loss to eating nothing but Subway for a year straight. But in 2015, the FBI completed a 4-year-long surveillance operation to bring him down for owning excessive amounts of CP. They began investigating after Fogle made some disturbing comments about children to a female reporter, who started recording her conversations with him and passing them on to the FBI. In many of these conversations, he bragged about molesting children and even asked her if he could put cameras in her kids' bedrooms. When going to battle against enemies riding elephants, the Indian Rajputs would put fake trunks on their horses, making them appear as baby elephants, which the enemy's elephants refused to attack. During the Cold War, CIA agents used a secret method of communication based on how their shoelaces were tied. In 1973, the U.S. Army developed an anti-tank grenade by hollowing out a Nerf football and filling it with explosive charges. But the ball never made it to the battlefield since the explosives gave it an unpredictable flight. Many warships used to be painted like optical illusions. The purpose of this dazzle camouflage was not to conceal the ship, but rather to mislead the enemy by making the ship's speed and range more difficult to estimate, much to the same effect as patterns seen on zebras, giraffes, and jaguars. Here's a 1997 photo of Las Vegas police facing Mike Tyson after he'd just bitten off the ear of Evander Holyfield during a boxing match. Tyson claimed he was in a primal, blacked-out state and literally wanted to kill his opponent. In 2013, a Brazilian woman confessed to lacing her cooter with poison so that her husband would die after going down on her. This fox drowned in a frozen lake and was cut out and displayed as a warning for people to keep off the ice. Just last week, an 88-year-old Frenchman caused an entire hospital to be evacuated for the strangest of reasons. He had a shell from World War I stuck inside of his anus, which the hospital considered to be a bomb threat, and a defusing team was called in. They determined the shell was not at risk of exploding, and it was surgically removed by doctors. Once believed to be aliens, this is one of the many 2,000-year-old elongated skulls that were discovered on Paracas Peninsula in Peru. Cranial elongation was commonly practiced by the Paracas people by tightly wrapping the head in cloth during the first few years of life. These toilets in a medieval castle should make you feel thankful for modern plumbing. After Hurricane Dorian, a woman took a walk along a beach in Virginia and found this incredible collection of prehistoric shark teeth just lying on the sand. An incredible discovery was recently made during renovations at a church in Naples, Italy. Behind a 16th century painting called Life of San Severo, workers found a second hidden painting depicting St. George slaying a dragon. When Teddy Roosevelt was 25 years old, his wife and mother died just hours apart from each other on Valentine's Day. For his journal entry that day, he drew a large black X and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." These are the 1888 graves of a Catholic woman and her Protestant husband. Due to religious restrictions at the time, they weren't allowed to be buried together in the same cemetery. So this was their creative way of being united and together forever. The Hassanlu lovers died around 800 BC and were discovered in Iran in 1972. They appeared to have died while kissing each other and remained that way for 2,800 years. In 1994, a pair of Japanese virgins waited more than a decade to finally break the ice with each other on their wedding night. But sadly, each of them had undiagnosed heart conditions and both died from heart attacks as they made love for the first and last time. When she was 16 years old, Annalise Michaels started eating her own hands and drinking her urine while suffering from seizures and delusions. But her devout Christian family denied medical reasoning and instead blamed the devil. She underwent 67 different exorcisms and weighed less than 70 pounds by the time of her death. In 1998, 2-year-old Harrison Johnson was stung 432 times after disturbing a yellow jacket's nest in Florida. His parents simply asked locals to pray for him since their religion viewed medical care as witchcraft. They didn't bring him to the hospital until he stopped breathing more than 7 hours later, and he likely died an excruciating death. In 1991, a Nigerian prophet felt inspired by the story of David in the Bible and wanted to recreate it. So he went into a lion's cage at the zoo, believing that God would keep their mouths shut. Within seconds, he was completely torn to shreds. In 2018, American missionary John Allen Chow illegally traveled to North Sentinel Island to preach Christianity to an uncontacted tribe. He was well aware that the Sentinelese people were extremely violent toward outsiders, but he believed that God would protect him. Before he even stepped foot on land, he was greeted with an arrow through the heart. When he was a sophomore in college, NBA legend Karl Malone had a child with a 13-year-old girl. The son grew up to become NFL player Demetrius Bell, but he said he only met his dad on one occasion after graduating high school, where Malone told him that it was too late to start a father-son relationship and that he would have to make his way on his own. In 2008, a Brazilian priest strapped 1,000 balloons onto a lawn chair and rode it into the sky as part of a fundraiser. He was able to reach an altitude of around 20,000 feet before losing contact with authorities. Over a month later, the lower half of his body was found floating near an oil rig. British entrepreneur Jimmy Heselden became the CEO of Segway Inc. after purchasing the company in 2009. The next year, he died from blunt force trauma after falling off a cliff on a Segway. Every year, about 150 people are killed by falling coconuts across the globe. Famous whiskey distiller Jack Daniel died after kicking his safe in frustration because he forgot his combination. He injured his big toe and it got infected, so he had to have his entire foot amputated. But the infection spread to the rest of his body and he died from blood poisoning. After Carrie Fisher passed away in 2016, her ashes were placed inside of an urn shaped like a giant Prozac pill. The giant pill was apparently her favorite possession since it was a reference to her battle with bipolar disorder. This famous mummy appeared to be satisfying himself during his final moments in 79 AD. In 1880, the Queen of Thailand's boat capsized on the way to her palace. But despite many witnesses, nobody dared to save the drowning queen and her daughter. This was because touching the queen under any circumstances was a crime punishable by death. Bobby Leach was a world-renowned daredevil who became the second person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. A few years later, he died from a vicious infection after slipping on an orange peel. In 1996, a man named Michael Paul was on his way home from church when he decided to crack his neck just like any other time. But a few minutes afterwards, he suddenly started sweating profusely and then went pale. By the time Michael was brought to a hospital, he had already slipped into a coma and died after 12 days of being on life support. An autopsy later revealed that the neck crack must have damaged one of the main arteries to his brain and resulted in a fatal stroke. Actor Mickey Rourke was a heartthrob of the 1980s until he quit his acting career to become a boxer. But after multiple facial injuries and botched plastic surgeries, he now looks like he's wearing a mask of someone else's face. Earlier last year, an Alabama man was arrested for criminal littering after putting flowers on the grave of his fiancée who died in a car crash in 2021. While filming an episode of Storage Wars, Daryl Sheets once discovered a dead body wrapped in plastic. Police later determined that the previous owner had murdered his wife and locked her body in a storage unit. Serial killer Edmund Kemper became friends with the very police officers that were investigating him. They called him Big Ed at the local bar and never would have suspected him in 1,000 years. When he initially confessed to being a serial killer, they laughed at him because they thought he was pulling a prank. A 57-year-old woman was riding a boat in Florida when an eagle ray suddenly leaped out of the water. The 75-pound ray smacked her directly in the head and she died almost immediately of a shattered skull. Attila the Hun was one of the most feared rulers throughout Europe during his reign, known for his brutal pillaging of Roman cities during the 5th century. But on his wedding night, he got drunk, fell asleep in his bed, and died of a nosebleed. A 17-year-old boy from Mexico City died after his girlfriend gave him a hickey. The suction created a blood clot that traveled to his brain, eventually causing a stroke. A Texas man was warned by bystanders to not go swimming in a harbor that was filled with alligators. But he shouted his last words, "F them alligators," before jumping in and being torn to shreds. In 1991, retired truck driver Terry Horton found a painting at a California thrift shop that she purchased for $5. She thought it was hideous and planned on throwing darts at it until one of her friends suggested getting it checked out. It ended up being a priceless painting by Jackson Pollock worth right around $50 million. In 2015, a man swimming near Huntington Beach, California was suddenly struck in the back by a great white. After making it ashore and going to the hospital, doctors assured him that he'd be fine. But upon seeing his x-rays, they realized he had a cancerous tumor that they were just barely able to remove in time. In 1923, a young jockey named Frank Hayes suffered a heart attack and suddenly died in the middle of a horse race. But his body remained on the saddle throughout the race, and his horse Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line first. This was the first time that Hayes had ever won a race, and the last. Bubble boy David Vedder was born with a severe immunity disorder where he basically had no immune system at all, meaning even the most harmless germs could easily end up killing him. Because of this, he spent his entire life inside of a bubble and could only receive air, water, and food if it had been sterilized first. At age 12, David received a bone marrow transplant from his sister, the only treatment available that would allow him outside of his bubble. But the marrow sadly contained traces of a dormant virus, and David passed away a few months later. Kidum Cave in Kenya is believed to be the original source of Ebola and Marburg, two of the deadliest diseases known to man. A 2007 expedition found evidence that the vector species was most likely the African fruit bat, or more specifically, their guano. Either way, the cave is known to scientists as one of the most dangerous places on the planet. The most valuable tooth in the world belonged to Sir Isaac Newton, who died nearly 300 years ago. In 1816, it sold for $3,600, which equates to more than $75,000 today. After fears that they were wiped out by bushfires, the rare pygmy possum was thankfully rediscovered in 2020. Located in various museums, these are the only 3 authentic Jolly Roger flags in the world. They were flown to identify pirate ships before or during attacks in the early 18th century. Spotted Lake in Canada features distinctive patterns due to its high concentrations of various minerals. The Formosan clouded leopard was declared legally extinct in 2013 after having no sightings since 1983. But in 2019, it was spotted for the first time in nearly 40 years in eastern Taiwan. In 1993, a Canadian lawyer named Gary Hoy claimed to a group of students that the windows in his building were unbreakable. To prove this, he threw himself at the window at full force. While the glass didn't break, the frame popped out and Gary fell 24 stories to his death. The man who once had the longest beard in the world died after he accidentally stepped on it and broke his neck. In 2010, an MI6 agent was found naked and dead inside of a padlocked bag in his London home. Police concluded that he accidentally locked himself in the bag and died as a result. In Houston, Texas, a 19-year-old man named Rashad died while attempting to play Russian roulette. Apparently, he didn't know how the game worked since he tried using a semi-automatic pistol instead of a revolver. Author Lewis Carroll wanted to marry an 11-year-old girl named Alice when he was 31. It's widely believed that his book Alice in Wonderland was inspired by his obsession for little Alice Liddell. If Finding Nemo was scientifically accurate, Nemo's dad would have turned into a female and mated with Nemo after his mom died. When Disney released Princess and the Frog, it caused a minor salmonella outbreak across the country. Over 50 kids were hospitalized after kissing a frog. The reason why Beauty and the Beast was written was to encourage young girls to become more accepting of arranged marriages. Following 9/11, an entire scene from Lilo and Stitch had to be edited. A 747 airliner that was flying through a city was changed to a spaceship flying through the mountains. During an interview shortly before his death, Michael admitted that he would often talk to child mannequins just to feel less alone. He would also frequently cry at the sight of kids playing in the park since it was something that Michael would never experience himself. Here's a 1985 prediction of what Michael would look like in the year 2000 versus what he actually ended up looking like. Michael had a meeting scheduled at the top of one of the Twin Towers on 9/11. But after talking with his mom on the phone all night, he overslept and missed the appointment. In 2003, a supermarket was once completely shut down so that Michael could live out his lifelong dream of shopping like an ordinary person. All the other shoppers were either actors or his friends, and they paid no attention to Michael. He played around the store like a child and even compared the experience to going to Disneyland. During World War II, Native American man Joe Medicine Crow completed all 4 feats required to become a war chief: touching an enemy without killing him, taking an enemy's weapon from him, leading a war party, and stealing an enemy horse. He overachieved on the last one by stealing 50 horses from the Nazi SS, singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode off. In 1941, a Polish soldier named Witold Pilecki volunteered to be placed in a concentration camp to prove to the Allies that the Holocaust was real. While a prisoner at Auschwitz, he organized resistance movements and eventually escaped after 3 years of imprisonment. Until he escaped, little had been known by the rest of the world about how the Germans ran the camps, as they were thought to be internment camps or large prisons rather than death camps. In 1859, a massive solar flare erupted on the sun. It blasted high-energy particles toward the Earth, creating brilliant auroras as far south as Hawaii. If a solar flare of that magnitude erupted today, it would likely decimate the entire power grid on Earth. In November of 1833, there was such an intense meteor shower that hundreds of thousands of meteors could be seen across the skies of North America every hour. It was such an extraordinary event that many people woke up from the brightness and thought the world was ending. The loudest sound ever heard on Earth was the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The explosion ruptured the eardrums of sailors 40 miles away, and people as far as 3,000 miles away reported hearing it as a distant roar of heavy guns, which would be like sitting in Boston and hearing a sound that came all the way from Ireland. This extremely rare red sprite lightning was captured over Texas last year. This happens as a result of strong electrical discharges that occur high above thunderstorm clouds, creating a range of visible red shapes that briefly flicker in the sky. On January 19, 1977, something happened for the first and only time in the history of Miami. It snowed. With only 6 of them ever officially recorded, a condor is the rarest event in golf. It happens when a player puts the ball in the hole in 4 strokes under par, such as a hole-in-one on a par 5. This deliciously rare bison ribeye makes me feel thankful that they weren't hunted to extinction in the 1800s. These giant stick insects known as tree lobsters were thought to be wiped out by rats in 1920, but in 2001, 24 of them were found in a small bush on an Australian island. No one knows how they got there, but they were the last known survivors of the species at the time. In 2003, a skeleton measuring 6 inches long was found in a remote part of Chile's Atacama Desert. Due to its elongated skull and rather developed bones considering its size, the specimen was initially rumored to be an alien. But after extensive testing, scientists determined that it was more likely the skeleton of a stillborn human girl that had close to 70 different genetic mutations. According to a recent study, people in the US who were born before 1996 have a slightly lower IQ than those born afterwards. This is due to the negative effects of leaded gasoline, which was finally banned completely on January 1st, 1996. In June of 2021, a massive 1,174-carat diamond was discovered by miners in Botswana. It's the 3rd largest diamond ever found and can likely fetch more than $60 million at auction. Here's a rare sighting of the tadpole shrimp, a prehistoric creature that has existed on Earth for more than 500 million years. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, there's a rare breed of dog that has 2 noses. They were likely bred and brought there by Spanish conquistadors back in the 16th century. Costing around $300 per pound, A5 olive Wagyu beef is quite literally the rarest steak in the world. It's extremely rare to see a living giant squid, but in 2015, one swam into a harbor near Tokyo. A diver jumped in and swam alongside it to capture some incredible footage of the massive creature. A sheep-herding dog named Casper faced off against 11 threatening coyotes and killed 8 of them on the farm. He then went missing for 2 days, most likely to track the remaining coyotes and finish the job. His vet said he's incredibly lucky to be alive, while his owner agreed to let him retire. During World War II, a German pilot spotted an American pilot's crippled plane in the sky. He noticed that the gunner was dead, the crew was injured, and that they didn't pose any threat. So instead of destroying the plane, he led it to safety and spared the men's lives. 40 years later, the 2 pilots reunited and became fishing buddies. After TV star Jack Benny died in 1974, his widow Mary received a red rose in the mail. After several days of receiving a new rose each day, she finally called to find out who was sending them. The florist told her that Jack had arranged for a new rose to be sent to her every day until she died. As part of a project called As If Nothing Happened, an AI drew Michael Jackson as if he were still alive and had never received plastic surgery. Shortly after Jackson was charged with child molestation in 2003, his pet chimpanzee Bubbles reportedly attempted to take his own life. Michael suffered from severe insomnia and didn't receive any real sleep in the 60 days leading up to his death. Instead, his doctor had been putting him under general anesthesia every night, which would end up killing him at the age of 50. The details revealed in Michael Jackson's autopsy report were nothing short of disturbing. He was almost completely bald and had a number of cosmetic tattoos, including permanent eyeliner and lip liner. He had puncture wounds all over his body and had nothing but pills in his stomach at the time of death. In 1999, Martin Lawrence collapsed from heat stroke while jogging in heavy clothing to prepare for his role in Big Mama's House. He recovered in the hospital after entering a 3-day coma on a ventilator due to his body temperature reaching 107 degrees. This map published by FEMA shows the potential US targets in a nuclear war scenario. If you're from the Northeast like me, you might want to start building that bunker. Here's a photo of 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. being led to the room in which he was executed in 1944. He was given the electric chair after being convicted of murdering 2 white girls in South Carolina. The all-white jury determined he was guilty after only 10 minutes of deliberation, and he became the youngest person to be executed in U.S. history. Stinney was exonerated 70 years later after a court finally recognized that he'd received an unfair trial.